that the story hasn't finished. I mean, having made a book about a particular landscape doesn't mean there aren't more pictures to be made there, because the landscape continues to evolve. People's lives continue to change. The economy changes as well. And so at this point, I realized that I'll never be done photographing this region. And when I first photographed here, no one called it the Rust Belt. That was a term that sort of came to prominence later. And it might have originally been derogatory, but as you were talking about people's pride in their landscape, in their place, there's also a pride in the idea of the Rust Belt. That it's exactly what you were describing, where people are proud of the place they're from and what that place has done and the work that they've done in that place and what that place has contributed to the country.
Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thank you, Patrick.
Just as we begin here, let's go ahead and get started with introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll kind of start there.
Okay. My name is Andrew Borowiec. I'm a photographer. I live in the United States in Akron, Ohio, and I make photographs about places.
What I love about your work is that you're taking a look at landscape and you're doing it in a very interesting way. And I know the things that you're looking at are things that people are concerned about, especially in the U.S., about this change of this post-industrial look at it. But let's start from where you come from. You said you're in Ohio. Have you always been in Ohio?
No. I moved here to take a job teaching photography back in 1984.
Oh, wow.
I was born in New York City, but in fact, we moved abroad when I was 9 months old, and I spent until I lived overseas, always in French-speaking countries, until I came here to go to college. So, it was, and then when I came, I went to college on the East Coast, and I lived in New York, and I went to grad school on the East Coast. So moving to Ohio was quite a revelation. I moved here in 1984 and had no idea that I'd be here. What is that, 40 years later? Yeah.
Yeah, it is 40 years later. So I guess it's you found your way into photography, and I thought it was an interesting story. I read it in an interview that you found your way into photography in a little different way. It was like you were really interested in something else. If I'm not mistaken, it was zoology. You were thinking about being a zoologist, and you started to pick up a camera. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd actually had a camera. I was trying to figure it out the other day in preparation for this, and I figured out I think I was 7 years old when my parents gave me a camera for Christmas, an old Agfa roll film camera. And then in my teen years, I had a Kodak Instamatic, only a sort of a high-end one. But I wasn't really interested in photography. It was just this thing that, you did. But when I was in high school, I was hoping to become a zoologist. I was interested in animals, in animal behavior. I read an interview with the director of the Berlin Zoo, Bernard Grzimek, who was very famous in the field, and he sort of had a permanent expedition in the Serengeti in Tanzania. And somewhere in the interview, someone said, well, what advice can you give, people who want to work for you? And he said, well, it's helpful if people know Swahili and if they know photography. So I bought a book called Teach Yourself Swahili, and I took a class at the Migros night school. Migros is a Swiss chain of supermarkets, and they had night classes. And I took a photo class. It was pretty hardcore in retrospect, because we didn't buy chemicals. We would go to the pharmacy and we'd ask them for, 5 grams of metol and 100 grams of sodium sulfite, and make our own developers. And, really doing it from scratch. But anyway, I became, at that point, so I learned the nuts and bolts of photography, how to process film, how to, use a camera and so forth. And I sort of was quite interested in it, and I got roped into working for the high school yearbook. And then the school had organized a trip. There's in Switzerland, they have there's like a fall break, like our spring break, but it happens in the fall as well. And so they organized a fall break trip to Florence. And the yearbook people said, well, since you're going on that, why don't you take pictures for the yearbook? And I'm sure, why not? And I took pictures nonstop on that trip. I mean, I have pictures of, train workers at the Milan train station who were changing trains. And later, when I looked at my pictures, I was really kind of interested in what I was seeing. And it wasn't what I'd expected, and it wasn't anything I'd thought about before. There's a photograph taken in a cloister in Florence, and there's a group of 4 white men dressed in dark suits, carrying a coffin, and sitting on a step against a wall, there's a black man dressed entirely in white with what's either a notebook or I think he's actually drawing, but it's kind of this, what interested me at that time was just the odd coincidence. It seemed as if it was kind of a story that was interrupted, almost like a frame from a movie. You don't really know what's going on or what's about to happen or anything like that. And yet there's all this information that creates the sense of a narrative in progress. And, that led me to look at more photographs, and I discovered the work of Henri Cartier-Bresson, for example. I went and saw a big show of his in Fribourg, which is a town in central Switzerland, that summer. And I just became more and more interested in photography per se. And then I decided that I wasn't going to study zoology. I didn't know what I was going to do, but my plans to go to university in England changed, and I decided to come to college in the US. I did have an agreement with my mother that I would not take photography in college. I would learn something useful for a profession.
Really?
Really. That resolved. Oh, yeah. I mean, she, understandably, I didn't disagree with her. I didn't see how one would make a living as a photographer. I mean,
Yeah.
But my resolve pretty much fell apart by the second semester, freshman year, when in fact I did take an intro photo class, even though, technically, of course, I already had learned all that stuff. But we had a great teacher, a woman named Drew Shipman, who I don't know what's happened to her since. I mean, we're talking about 1975. So spring of 1975. I'm in this class with Drew Shipman, and she had actually studied with Gary Winogrand, whose work I was vaguely familiar with, but didn't really know that well. But she'd taken classes with him at the Chicago Art Institute and in New York at Cooper Union. And so I ended up taking photography classes throughout my college career, even though in the end I majored in Russian. And in my senior year, my last year of college, I really had no idea what I was going to be doing. I mean, I was completing a degree in Russian. I was working as a staff photographer for a weekly paper in the Philadelphia main line.
I was going to ask you about that. Was it Russian language or Russian history? What were you?
It was sort of all of it. I never got very good at language, not fluent. I actually spoke better Russian as a kid. My mother was born in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And when I was growing up in Tunisia, my grandmother sent a woman over to teach us Russian. She was kind of a nanny. And I had to write letters every week to my grandmother in Russian. It was horrible. It was a real ordeal. But and then in high school, I actually took an O-level in Russian. The British educational system has O-levels and A-levels. They're sort of, A-levels are at the end of your 13th year, and O-levels are taken, I think, at the end of your 11th year, something like that. But I did take the O-level in Russian so that I wouldn't have to do a language requirement. So I placed into second year Russian when I got to college. Anyway, so I spoke some Russian, but it was also history. It was also literature. I mean, I didn't read War and Peace in Russian. I read it in English, stuff like that. I'd still be average.
Yeah. Well, I thought that was an interesting. It was an interesting thing to major in, and then considering your path and where you've ended up. So I think that's really, really interesting. So continue. You were saying something after the Russian. Then you met someone, or?
Well, so there I am in my last year of college. My good friend Mark had graduated a year earlier. I'd taken a year off to travel, and he got a job working for a photography museum in New York City, the International Center of Photography. He also was the staff photographer for National Lampoon magazine. So I went up to New York over spring break to interview at publishing houses, because basically with a bachelor's degree in the humanities from, a relatively good college, that's kind of what you do. And I interviewed at Macmillan, I don't remember where else. But my friend lived in ICP. They had maids' quarters from when it was originally a private mansion, and he had a maid's room, and I stayed with him. And I got snowed in. It was a freak March snowstorm. My car was literally buried. I didn't even know, I couldn't even find it. It was one of many white mounds on East 94th Street. And I was there longer than I expected, to the point where I was there for the opening of an exhibition. And in those days, I always took pictures wherever. I mean, I would take my camera with me to the movies. Like, you never know, something interesting might happen. So, of course, I photographed during the opening. And the director of the museum, a man called Cornell Kappa, who was the younger brother of the great war photographer Robert Kappa, Cornell saw me taking pictures and said, ask me to send him my contact sheets, which I did. And he then hired me to come and photograph subsequent events at ICP for the rest of that semester, other openings mainly. But it still didn't tell me what I was going to do with my life. I didn't have a job. I didn't follow through on any of the interviews with publishing houses. And I'm standing in ICP's bookstore complaining about my fate to the bookstore manager. And he says, well, what would you really like to do if you could? And I said, well, if I had to have a job, I wouldn't mind working for the Rencontre d'Arles, which is this photography festival in the south of France that I'd attended a couple of times. I was in a show there. And he said, well, as it turns out, Lucien Clerc, who's the man who directed the Rencontre and the founder of the festival, is in town right now. And I'm like, oh, really? And a few minutes go by, and he says, oh, and he just walked in. I said, what? And I look up, and I see Lucien, whom I knew by sight. I didn't know him, but I knew him by sight. I see him walking across the lobby of ICP to the elevator, and I run after him. And it's a slow elevator. It had double folding doors. It's an old building, so it had like a Paris elevator. Anyway, so I had time to catch up, and I get in the elevator with Lucien Clerc, and I have the time it takes to get from the ground floor to the fourth floor, in which I give him my pitch, and I say to him in French, I'd like to come and work for you. I'm a photographer. I've been taking photo classes, whatever. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I sort of gave him the 10-second presentation. And he says, do you speak English? I said, yes. And he says, okay, well, when you get to Europe this summer, I told him I was going to Europe for the summer. My mother lived there. He says, give me a call when you get there and we'll give you a job. And that's exactly what happened. I called him. I took the train down to Arles. I was told that I was the assistant director of their workshop program, which, meant everything from setting up enlargers in the darkroom, which was in this 16th century former priory with crumbling walls, the worst possible place you could find for a darkroom, essentially. And I stayed there for the summer working for the Rencontre until they were over. And then I was back to square one. I still had nowhere to go or what I was going to do. Lucien said he'd take me on as his assistant, but unpaid. And then my friend Mark in New York wrote to me. This is, the 70s. You corresponded by mail, right? There was no internet, no email. But he wrote me a letter, which went to the Rencontre, and he said there's an opening for another live-in super, basically, live-in concierge, superintendent at ICP if I'm interested. And Cornell Kappa was in Arles, and I found out where he was staying and tracked him down to his hotel and said, I'd like that job. And he said, okay. So I moved to New York. I had a place to live, paid utilities. I thought I would try to be a freelance photographer. And because I was at ICP, anytime anybody would call ICP saying, we need a photographer, do you know anybody for this or that? I would get that job. So I did a lot of assisting. I did PR photography. I did fashion photography. I did floral photography. Did you know that was a thing?
Actually, I did.
All sorts of stuff. And then they made me their staff photographer. they created a position for me I think I got $400 a month, which was, considering I didn't have room and board. I mean, I had board, but I was living for free in their building. That was great. And and I had a lot of free time to do those other jobs. And the best thing about working for the Rencontre and working at ICP, I got to meet all my heroes. I got to know Robert Frank. I got to meet Cartier-Bresson in Arles. And no, in New York, I have photographs that I took of Cartier-Bresson.
You got to meet Robert Frank?
And I got to meet Robert Frank, and later I went to his studio.
That's amazing.
I met June Leaf. Anyway,
how cool are you?
It was, I actually count the people I didn't meet more than the people I met, because in those years working at both those institutions, I met everybody. I went and saw André Carthage on his deathbed, sadly.
Wow.
Okay. I never met Brassai. I never met Walker Evans, who died in 1975. It was really before my time. But I pretty much met, everybody else that I was interested in from that era. It was great.
That's amazing.
An amazing, sort of introduction to the field. But after a year of working at ICP, doing all those different kinds of freelance work, I learned that I had no interest at all in any of that kind of work. I wanted to make the kind of pictures that Gary Winogrand was making. Oh, I forgot. I'd taken a workshop with Gary Winogrand while I was in college at ICP as well. And Gary, so I knew Gary. I got to know him, not intimately, but pretty well. And at one point, he said to me, you should go to graduate school, but there's only one place you should go, and that's Yale, where you can study with Todd Papageorge. And, here was the person I considered the greatest photographer in the world, telling me to go study with somebody. So of course I did exactly that. I applied to Yale only there. I had met Todd Papageorge because he had a show. He was in a group show at ICP, and I was taking a picture of him with, I don't know, other photographers. I don't remember who. And he commented on my camera, which he recognized. It was a Leica M2. And we started talking, and then I found out who he was. And I had actually read, I'm trying to think if his monograph, if Gary Winogrand's Public Relations had come out yet. Yes, I had read his introduction to public relations and a couple of other things he'd written. So, he knew me. And so, I applied and I got into the program, and then I went to grad school and spent 2 years not thinking about anything other than trying to make good pictures, which was a struggle. But I wasn't thinking about a career or a job or anything like that at that point. And so, 2 years go by.
And I think it's, to my, what I was going to say is it's interesting that you kind of joining ICP and getting to, I'm sure you saw exhibitions and you were seeing great photographers come through, and you were talking to them and being a part of it, and then going to Yale and then studying there. And I just think that's a priceless experience. But yet now you're trying to kind of carve your own path, go your own way. And you said that was difficult. So talk to me about that.
Well, so, the kind of photography that interested me was what was then called street photography, a term that's become so corrupted now that it means all sorts of things. It even means photographing streets. But at the time, it rather specifically, Gary hated the term, but it was generally understood to mean what the layman would call candid photography. So if you think about Cartier,
I don't like the term either. And when
you think about Gary's work, or you think about Robert Frank's work, those for me, they were the holy trinity. They were the photographers that I wanted to emulate. And while I was at Yale, it became a problem. Gary would come up and do critiques for us. And since I was actually in New York, mostly not in New Haven, I would often arrange and we'd ride the train together. But at one point it came up in the critiques that my photographs were too much like Winogrand's. That, there was nothing original about them. I was just sort of being Winogrand with greater or lesser degrees of success. And even Gary kind of commented on that at one point. And I found myself kind of adrift. I understood the point. I didn't disagree with it, but I didn't really know exactly who I was as a photographer at that point. This is about halfway through, by the end of my first year there. So the first semester of the second year of the program, it's a 2-year program, Todd Papageorge went on sabbatical, and they brought in the photographer Frank Golke to teach. I don't know if you're familiar with Frank's work. He's one of the photographers that were in the original New Topographics show at the George Eastman House in 75. So he's an American landscape photographer, sort of initially known for photographs he made of grain elevators in the American plains. Okay. I'd seen those figures in high school in Camera Magazine. And Frank came and taught, and I, at that point, was starting to be more interested in photographs that were not of people, that were not candid photographs of people interacting in public places. So there were a couple of things that happened that conspired together to shift my interest. One was Frank Golke's arrival at Yale. The other, besides the fact that clearly I wasn't getting anywhere with my own work, there was nothing original about it. But at the same time, I don't remember if it was my first or second year at Yale, but John Tchaikovsky and Maria Moritz Hamburg had organized the first of 4 shows about the work of Eugene Atget at the Museum of Modern Art in MoMA in New York. Maria Morris had done extensive research on dating the work, figuring out how it was structured, and they did these 4 shows of 4 consecutive years. One of my teachers at Yale, Richard Benson, had worked on the separations for the 4 books that accompanied the show. There was a hardcover book of 80 photographs or 100 photographs for each of the 4 shows. And I saw the first show, and I was really blown over. I had seen Atget's work before. There'd been a show that had some of his work in it at ICP, but it wasn't his most interesting work. It was a show about his gardens, but it was just not a very good selection. But that show was amazing. And John Tchaikovsky's introduction was really a revelation. And I'd heard him speak. I heard him give a lecture the previous year. While I was at ICP, I went up to a conference in upstate New York that people who taught photography at ICP talked me into going along with them. And Tchaikovsky talks about it was Tchaikovsky talking about Atget, and I remember this paragraph that stuck with me where he talks about he compares the act of photography, the art of photography, to the act of pointing, of saying, look at that. But he goes on to talk about how obviously certain people will point at more interesting things than others, things that might be funnier, more significant, more telling, more moving. And some people might point to a broader range of what they're pointing at. There's the idea of context. How much are you showing? Am I pointing to you? Am I pointing to the whole studio around you? Anyway, so I was familiar with Tchaikovsky's writings. I had The Photographer's Eye, and I had Looking at Photographs, and I'd studied those obsessively while I was in college. Between reading what he wrote about Atget and seeing the show, I really what interested me in photography and as a photographer completely changed. It didn't completely change. I was interested in the real world and as life that goes on in the real world, and that certainly didn't change as I turned away from trying to make pictures like Winogrand to trying to make photographs of places. But it was, that was the moment where I stopped being what was called a street photographer and became a landscape photographer, essentially. And so the work that I did my second year at Yale, starting with the previous summer when I went back to Switzerland, and the portfolio I left at Yale were all photographs. Well, the portfolio I left were all photographs of modern Switzerland, of sort of not, one's conventional idea of what the Alps look like, but of what, living in a modern city in Switzerland looks like. I know I'm digressing a good deal here because I'm really thinking about. But
no, I love it. It's wonderful.
Well, and talk about Atget, I don't know. It just made me start to look at other kinds of photographs and start to think about the world differently. there's one additional thing that happened simultaneously with all that. And it's hard to pinpoint a single factor. So, we have Frank Gohlke arriving at Yale. We have the Atget show. We have what Tchaikovsky's written about Atget. And Frank Gohlke made us read an essay in a book called The Necessity for Ruins by a guy called John Bringerhofer Jackson, J.B. Jackson, who is famous as the originator or one of the founders of a branch of geography called landscape studies. And I read that essay, we talked about it in class, and it was enough of a revelation to me that I ended up reading pretty much everything he wrote since then. This was early on in his career. Since then, I think he published 1 or 2 books of essays at that point, which I assiduously read. To put it really simply, but not inaccurately, what Jackson talks about and what landscape studies are about is this idea that if you look really carefully at a place, at the clues that a place provides, at the details of the place, if you're attentive and intelligent about what you're looking at and think about it, you can understand the story of that place and the story of the people who have used that place, who inhabit that place, who have altered that place. And that idea of thinking about the world almost analytically or looking really, really carefully at the world pretty much ended up informing how I photograph to this day. I'm not photographing instinctively. I'm not photographing emotionally. I'm really looking at places, trying to understand them. Sometimes I've read about them before seeing them. Usually it's the opposite. I find a place that interests me and then I read about it, go back. But so all of that happened, simultaneously, and that's what led me to become, the photographer that I've continued to be for these last 40 years.
You did such a good job of answering all of the questions I usually ask right before we jump into your work. And I think you did a masterful job of talking about some of your influences. You talked about some influential people that have come into your world that kind of influence the way you work and the way you think. And you started to, was it directly after Yale that you started to focus on the project that you're still doing today? Is that kind of what did you do after Yale, and how did those epiphanies manifest itself into your work?
Well, when you tell these stories or you think back, and you look back on your life, things seem both clearer and more clear-cut than they really were. So no, I don't know if any of these were epiphanies. It's just when I think back on my progress, I can pinpoint those things that turn out to have been important. The Atget show, reading Tchaikovsky, Frank Gohlke, and so forth. These are things that turn out to be crucial. At the time, perhaps there might have been other things that seemed equally important that now have lapsed into irrelevance. So, a lot of it was accident of circumstance. So at the end of my 2 years at Yale, I suddenly realized I'm graduating in a month and I don't know what I'm doing. And I went to the Yale placement office, or the Yale School of Art graduate placement office, and where they had universities and art schools and so forth had posted positions, and most of which I knew about already because we all went to the College Art Association and interviewed for jobs during the spring, and none of us got any of those jobs. But long story short, I got a job teaching photography at a private high school outside of Philadelphia. One of the things that attracted me to the job, besides the fact that it was the only job I had, so even if it had been unattractive, I was going to take it, was that they had just built a $3.5 million art center, and I would get to design the darkroom, design the photo facility, buy the equipment, and so forth. And I should preface this by saying that I'd actually taught photography already by that point. When I mentioned Drew Shipman teaching at Haverford, what I didn't tell you was the part that happened later where they fired her. because she was too outspoken, and they really didn't respect photography as an art form. It was an art department of 3 or 4 people, and they hated photography, and they fired Drew. We were furious, me and my friend Mark, and they didn't hire anybody to replace her. And so they had Mark and me teaching the intro photo class as college sophomores or as college juniors and seniors. They had somebody else come in and do the critiques, but 50% of the class was technical. And so we taught people how to expose film and develop it and print and so forth. So I'd wet my teeth teaching. And then my second year working in Arles, when I arrived, they said, we have a new job for you this year. You're going to be the liaison with an American art school that's bringing a group of students over for the festival. And that was Parsons School of Design from New York. And I show up, and the head of the program who was there, who was the person escorting the students, Ben Fernandez, promptly hires me on the spot to teach the class instead of him. So it was great for him because he didn't have to do anything. It was great for me because I was being paid simultaneously by the Rencontre and by Parsons. And after that, Ben hired me to teach for Parsons in Paris, which was actually at the American College in Paris, which I don't know if that exists anymore, but they were owned by Parsons. And I set up the darkrooms at ACP in Paris one summer.
Oh, wow.
And then I taught a class at the New School in New York when I was in grad school. I taught a class, a night class on the zone system. So I had, and I taught as a graduate assistant at Yale, in fact. I don't know if you've heard of Maggie Taylor. She's a great photographer, does these very elaborate composite scenes. She always tells people I was her first teacher, funnily enough. Even funnier. Awesome. She later ends up marrying a very well-known photographer called Jerry Uelsman. I knew Jerry Uelsman in Arles. I have pictures of Jerry with his brand new wife and his 6-month-old baby, who was named Andrew, years before Maggie Taylor ended up marrying Jerry. So it's kind of funny.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, so I got this job teaching at the high school, Germantown Academy, and I hated it. I was so miserable. I didn't mind the teaching photography part. In fact, I loved that. But I also had to teach graphic design, which I knew nothing about. And they said to me, don't worry, just follow the textbook. It didn't work. I was doing a terrible job, and I felt terrible knowing that. Even though the students might not have known, the school might not have cared, I cared. And I pretty much announced to them in February that I was quitting. Not that I was going to quit right then and there, but that at the end of the school year, I wasn't coming back. I had complained so much about teaching graphic design that they said, okay, you don't have to do that second term. We'll give you a study hall instead. So there I am in this auditorium full of 10th graders with maybe 5 or 6, girls in the front row trying to actually do their homework, and a room full of kids, throwing paper airplanes, trying to disrupt in any way possible. And my job as this kid, a year out of grad school who looks probably 5 years younger than he really is to try to impose discipline on these 10th graders. It was just the worst experience possible. So Ben Fernandez
said, you had it. Yeah.
Yeah, I had it. And I saw Ben, he came down to Philadelphia for an SPE conference, the guy who was the head of the program at Parsons School of Design and the New School for Social Research in New York. And he said, well, come up to New York and I'll give you a few classes. So I moved to New York. At that point, I got married that summer, and we moved to New York, and I taught at Parsons, and I pretty much, did all the work. I mean, Ben was the department chair, and he had an assistant, and I was the only other full-time employee in the photo program, other than a darkroom manager. So I rewrote the curriculum and all that stuff. It was, it was a great learning experience. But it was also very poorly paid. So I was also teaching at the New School at night, and I was also teaching at a school called the Laboratory Institute of Merchandising, which was a fashion business school. I taught fashion photography for those women. It was all women. Basically, it was a school that trained women to become buyers in the fashion business. It's still there. It's now called LIM University.
Okay.
But it was hard. It was very hard teaching all those classes, not having any money. And so I um, tried, I tried to get another job somewhere else, a full-time teaching job. And this was before computers. It's not literally before computers because my wife worked for PC Magazine, but it was before the average person had a computer. So, you had to type everything by hand. You had to take your resume to be typeset somewhere. And a friend of mine left the dean's office unlocked one night at Parsons so I could use this electric typewriter and do job applications. And I made my way through the applications that looked interesting. And I looked at the clock and I thought, well, I may not get this opportunity to use typewriter again for a while. So I went back to the beginning of the job listings, which were alphabetical, and I started to apply for those jobs that I really wasn't interested in, just in case. And I did one, and then I realized, oh, it's later than I thought, and I went home. And none of the jobs that I wanted even called me for an interview. And the semester ended, and I'm contemplating another year in New York. And my wife was working for a magazine. And in like mid-May, after school is out, I get a phone call from somebody who identifies themselves as being at the University of Akron. And they said, well, we've read your application and we'd like to bring you in for an interview. And I'd totally forgotten that I'd applied there. But Akron is at the front of the alphabet. So when I opened the college listing, I did that A and nothing more other than the ones I wanted at, well-known schools and schools on the East Coast and so forth. And I went out to Akron and spent a day there, flew back at night, and got the job. And bizarrely, here I am,
There you are.
40 years later. It's crazy.
It's an interesting story. And so now you're in Akron, and is this when your photography work started to evolve and you started looking at post-industrial America? Is that when it started? Or talk to me a little bit about the subject matter and what you take, what you photograph.
That's exactly right. I hadn't lived anywhere like this. I had lived on the East Coast in America only. When I was a kid, we'd come on home leave to Connecticut. And so I was really struck by this landscape in northeastern Ohio. This was a very industrial area. Northeast Ohio, for example, was the second largest producer of steel in America after the Pittsburgh area, which is, of course, adjacent. Akron itself was the headquarters of four of the five largest tire companies in the world, the fifth one being at that time Michelin. This was Rubber City. This is where all the tires for American cars were made for 100 years. So I was really intrigued by a landscape that, had its heart on its sleeve in a sense, where you could see what the place was there for, what was done, what was manufactured, how people made a living. It was a landscape dominated by the structures that had to do with the economic activity that went on in that landscape. It was a landscape full of factories, putting it simply. And the neighborhoods that were built for factory workers to live in, and so forth. And my initial interest was simply in those, gargantuan industrial structures. I photographed the rubber mills in Akron, which were closing at that time already. So in some cases, I photographed rubber mills being demolished. And I became interested in the neighborhoods that had grown up in Akron around the rubber mills, many of which bear the names of the companies that they worked at. So there's Firestone Park, Goodyear Heights, And after about a year of photographing in Akron, I started traveling a little further. I went up to Cleveland, but Cleveland was a bit problematical for me because I felt that everybody here was photographing Cleveland, that, there was no room for me. And so I started driving further, taking further and longer and longer day trips. I moved here in '84, in the summer of '86, so at the end of my second year. I drove into the Ohio River Valley, not really with any particular destination in mind or any particular awareness even that there was a big river there or that it was the boundary between Ohio and Pennsylvania at that place, but just wandering around. I mean, if I look back at my contact sheets from that summer, I was all over the place. But finding myself in the Ohio River Valley was a real revelation. I mean, there was this, what to me, absolutely fascinating and exotic landscape. Part of it had to do with the shape of the terrain. The glaciers from Canada flattened up the northern part of Ohio, but they didn't extend down as far as where the Ohio River Valley is, or even down as far as Canton, half an hour south of where I live. And so you have this terrain that's been steeply folded into creases, into hills and hollows by geological activity that remained that way, and that dictates patterns of human settlement, where you're going to put a home, where you're going to put a factory that requires water, where you're going to put a plant where you're making things that need to ship in have raw materials shipped in and finished products shipped out and so forth. All of that depends very much on the terrain. And so in the Ohio Valley, more than anywhere, it really seemed that was a landscape that was telling its story. And there was this contrast between these enormous steel mills, particularly, and these neighborhoods of, modest frame houses kind of clinging precariously to the slopes, or trailers by the river in the floodplain, which are essentially impermanent structures because the river used to flood periodically, every spring. So there was this fascination with that particular location, and I kept going back to it over and over again that summer. I probably have 30 photographs from that summer from the Ohio River Valley that I still think to this day are as good as anything I've ever done. And as I kept going back for the next couple of years, I also began to learn more about the place. I discovered a wonderful resource that continues to guide my work to this day, which were the WPA guides. I don't know if you're familiar with those. During the Depression, the WPA, the Works Projects Administration, which is known for creating jobs in all sorts of ways for people, mainly giant public construction projects. Here in Akron, we have a stadium that was built by the WPA. But one of the ways in which they created jobs was for writers. Writers need to work too. And so they commissioned writers all over the country to write these detailed guides to every one of the states. And there are a few to individual cities as well, Houston, New York, San Francisco. And the Pennsylvania guide, I think, is 800 pages long. There has never been a more detailed guidebook to any part of America than the WPA guide. So they were published over a period of, I want to guess, about a decade, from the very late 30s into the 40s. I think the Pennsylvania guide, for example, was published in 1941, or maybe that was West Virginia. Anyway, one I was just looking at recently. But they were particularly useful to me because they told me about what those places, what the Ohio River Valley was like in its heyday, at the height of its prosperity, in the years both before and during, and in some cases after, but typically up until the Second World War, when we led the world in steel production. If it were not for the work that was happening in the steel mills in the Ohio River Valley and around Pittsburgh, we would not have won World War II. It was the stuff that was being made there that made the difference. Obviously it's not the only factor, but certainly if we hadn't had that massive industrial production happening, landing craft being built on the Ohio River in Louisville, all that stuff, we wouldn't have prevailed. The Allies would not have prevailed. So the WPA books allowed me to really understand the place at a time when it was very, very prosperous. They would talk about Akron having, 20 movie theaters. and you'd read, you'd read about how bustling and busy and industrial these towns were, and then you'd go there. I would go there, and they'd be half abandoned. The only people left would be retirees because there were no jobs for the young people. So it gave me a sense of what had been there. It gave me an understanding of the history, and it was useful, not just in understanding what I was looking at, and in sort of, to some extent, influencing what I was thinking about when I was photographing or when I was identifying the thing I was going to photograph. This understanding what the function that something has, or the role that it might have played in a community, makes a difference. You're not just photographing the facade of a building because you like the way it looks. This used to be whatever, the general store for that town, and before it became a homeless shelter, before it became something else. That it also created a kind of sympathy and understanding between me and the people who lived in those places. They would often approach me with suspicion. I would say almost always, and to this day, that continues to be. It's worse now. It's much worse now. It's much harder. People are much more hostile.
Yeah, it is.
But back then, they would follow me around by telephone, so that as I moved, down an alley from one person's backyard to the next, she would call her neighbor, who would call her neighbor, and eventually somebody would come out and say, what were you doing over in Mrs. So-and-so's yard, half a mile away? And all morning long, they'd been tracking my progress as I wandered around. But so knowing about the place and the history of the place made me less of an outsider, less of a threat, made people more sympathetic to me. When they understood that my interest was deeper, it helped in terms of being able to navigate these neighborhoods. And funnily enough, sometimes I was able to tell them about things they didn't know. Did you know that this building used to be a factory for making such and such? And they go, no, I've lived with it my whole life. I never knew what it was. That's happened in Europe as well, in Belgium and north of France. So
everything just kind of gets repurposed, Yeah. And, you were talking about that area. I actually lived in Pittsburgh for a few months. I was there for like 90 days. And the topography is fascinating. You would think you're really close to somewhere, but you're really not. And when you look at it on the map, I guess you don't have that back then, but I'm like, I'm only 5 minutes away. But no, it's like 30 minutes because you have to go around because it's a mountain. The other part that I thought was really, really interesting is that they're very, very proud of that history that you're talking about. That steel production, that being the industrial heartland, and a lot of identity came from that. And I think that's really, really interesting. And you said the book was 800 pages long, which I've read a few books. It sounds like a Tolkien book, but yeah, but was it written well? Were they how was reading that? Was it very indexical, or was it actually like good stories? Okay.
They're guidebooks. So they're not structured like a novel. They're guidebooks. So they have like a first section which talks about different categories of the state, its history, agriculture, industry, architecture, music, and so forth. Then there's a second middle section where there are extensive chapters on each of the major towns or cities. Lancaster, York, Pittsburgh, obviously. And then the last section consists of these driving tours. And the books come with a big unfoldable map. And the tours take you all over the state, diagonally left up, northwest to southeast, diagonally the other way, on all the major highways, crisscrossing. Wow. And so I think for Pennsylvania, there are 20 different tours, plus side trips like tour number 14, but there's also 14A, which will take you, to another town that's not really on the main tour, but worth traveling to, like the Michelin guides say.
It's worth to go see. Yeah,
it's worth the excursion. But let's say you're actually following one of those roads. Let's say you're driving on, Route 30, which is goes from Philadelphia all the way to San Francisco, and you're reading the book. And every single community that the road traverses, it will tell you something about it. It'd say, okay, here you are in such and such a place. It just consists of a few coal mining shacks, population 30, but it pays homage to this place. There's no place ignored, which is amazing.
Wow.
And it's particularly amazing.
And it's comprehensive.
It's super comprehensive. I just spent 3 days in the coal mining country in southern West Virginia. I just got home 3 days ago. I mean, it was, and I had the book with me, and I'd get to a place, there's nothing there, but the book talks about what used to be there. Or you get to a place and it's described as a bustling industrial hub, and there's no bustling at all. You have these places that have the infrastructure for a much larger population. And so there are all these amazing, beautiful, well-designed buildings that used to be, apartments and stores and banks and so forth that have survived because they were built to last.
So I'm going to ask you now, is this that series along the Ohio? Is this kind of where this begins? And we can start looking at some images now so you can kind of give us a look at it if you'd like.
That would be great. Yeah. So for me, Along the Ohio was the first sort of coherent body of work I did about this region. And again, It came about sort of by accident. I wasn't thinking about a book or even a project. I'm going to try to get an image here.
Perfect.
So this is a photograph that I made that first summer in the Ohio River Valley, possibly the first day or one of the first days, certainly early on that summer. And for me, it was a pivotal image because it sort of encapsulates everything that I was describing to you, Patrick, about the looming steel mills in the background, about the steeply folded terrain, about the modest ramshackle houses where the mill workers live. It begins for me in the Ohio River Valley. And I photographed there sort of for the rest of the 80s, and then got distracted by administrative duties at the university for a few years, and then returned to the Ohio River Valley to photograph in the 90s, in 93 and 94. And eventually that became a book. Here's another photograph that gives you, again, a sense of that terrain that I was describing, where you have you sort of see the whole story of the landscape unfolding in one picture. It's not just about the industrial activity or the factory in the background. It's not just about where the people live, but it's about how they relate to each other. And you can imagine the factory worker leaving this nice little neat house with its white picket fence, walking down the slope to the factory in the background, while the railroad bridge in the background is bringing in iron ore, which will then be processed. So when I talk about the landscape revealing its story earlier on, I'm talking about what you can see in a picture such as this.
What I love about this is that, this is the 80s and the 90s. This post-industrial period started around that time. I'm from Texas. And so we have little industrial places like this, but I didn't realize until I started traveling the United States, in particular the Northeast. And I had kind of driven I moved from from Pittsburgh to Minneapolis, and I was driving through these places, and I was starting to kind of see this change that was happening. This almost I don't know. It's I don't want to call it dilapidated, but it was, this almost migration away from it. Things were changing economically, which was changing the landscape. And is that what kind of made it fascinating for you? And I love that you found that guide, and you're reading this thing that was meant to kind of educate you and tell you a little bit about, but it almost felt like a nostalgic look at the world that was. And so you're looking at this time capsule description of a place, but being confronted with the reality of what it is today. And that's what drove these series. And so as you go through this, kind of talk a little bit about that, where you were, how it connected to that guide. I am fascinated. This is a documentary. This has to be.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
has to be a
So
documentary.
the only thing,
So good.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. But no, the only thing I would say
You're like,
is
yes.
there's nothing nostalgic about the WPA guides, and I certainly hope there's nothing nostalgic about my photographs. I mean, I'm photographing these places where life was both great, which is why there's that pride that you were talking about, because people had good jobs that paid good money that allowed them to send their kids to college, and their kids didn't have to end up working in a factory but could become doctors and lawyers and businessmen. So, I mean, there's that pride that you could achieve the American dream. You could come here from, Northeastern Europe and, toil with great difficulty, in a steel mill, but you saw progress. You could buy a house and put your kids through school, and in the end, you'd achieved a decent life for yourself and for your descendants. So I mean, here, but thinking about these, what has happened with the passage. To back up. So I don't think there's anything nostalgic about the WPA guides. They're simply describing the facts on the
What is it about that word?
Pardon me?
What is it about that word nostalgic?
Well, I mean, nostalgia to me suggests a kind of sentimental idealization of the past. And there's nothing sentimental about the WPA guide descriptions. They talk about places quite factually, and if a place is dirty, I don't remember which town it was I was reading about in West Virginia, but I remember reading the description and thinking, wow, I sure hope the city fathers didn't see this, because they talk about, what a unprepossessing place it was. I was trying to use a term.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So, I mean, for example, here, you're looking at, this is New Cumberland, West Virginia, on the Ohio River in 1993. And New Cumberland is typical of so many towns on the Ohio River Valley. This is not the center of town, which is a little bit to the right of the picture, where there's probably a dozen tall buildings, 2-3-story buildings. But at the same time, you're also seeing in this photograph the evidence of what life along the river is like. One of the things that I think characterizes my pictures is that I include a lot of detail that you don't really notice unless you look very, very carefully and think about. So at first glance, you're seeing a bunch of houses and some trailers and things and at least one structure that's clearly a ruin in the middle of the photograph. But notice the building on the right, how the porch is on the second floor, and that's the case as well with several that you see in the background, right? They don't have a front porch at the ground level. That's because the river floods, and until the Army Corps of Engineers put up a series of dams in the 40s, the river flooded every spring. And so if you were going to build a house in the floodplain close by the river, which you can see in the background here, right, this horizontal line along the trees in the background, if you're going to build a house there, you had to build it so that your main living space was one floor up, or else you'd get flooded out every year. And then you see that things change, and people have brought in housing that's for people who can't afford a real house. They brought in trailers, and those are just brought in and set up on the floodplain itself. And when the river floods, they get flooded, but the river floods less often now because we've engineered the landscape. The Ohio River is really more of a series of interconnected lakes than an actual river, in the sense that it's divided up by dams everywhere. And then you see the train tracks that pass through the center of the photograph, and you sort of think about how the train tracks are crucial to the economy of the region. As I've mentioned before, that's how stuff gets brought in and shipped out. And at the same time, they're sort of indicative of the topography that, the train has to run along the river because that's where the land is flat. That's where it's cheapest to build a train, to build a railroad. Here again, you have a similar kind of topography. I'm cheating a bit here because this isn't the Ohio River Valley. This is the Monongahela, which is one of the two rivers that forms the Ohio, which you'd know from living in Pittsburgh. But again, you have the relationship between these enormous structures that dominate the photograph and dominate the landscape, but that's not simply a visual issue. They dominate the economy. This is a power plant, but people have jobs and live in these places because of those structures. And yet at the same time, they totally alter your sense of the landscape. This is not, a conventionally beautiful scene, even though you're on the banks of a river. And again, I was saying, I try to incorporate details and information that, complicates the picture if the viewer notices that detail. And so in the foreground, right in the middle, you have a figure, an overweight man, huffing and puffing. You can tell he's bent over as he's pushing a lawnmower uphill. And to me, there was something about, his obvious effort and obvious tiredness that seemed to be a kind of metaphor for the futility of trying to have a perfectly maintained, middle American lawn when you're living in the shadow of a giant power plant that's spewing coal dust everywhere.
And what's funny is, as an outsider, you look at it and you just that structure is almost imposing, and it's almost like something you didn't want to look at, And a lot of people, if you're an outsider in that town, you're like, why would you even live there? But so many of these people look at this as an economic way. It's a blessing, that place, And so that's what feeds us, This is why we're here, And right. It's all about a perspective too, I think that's interesting. Continue on, and I'm curious to see what else you have here.
Well, to follow on what you were just saying, I mean, okay, this is again is a steel mill town. It's Mingo Junction, Ohio, which, by the way, is where the outdoor scenes in the movie The Deer Hunter were filmed. Even though the movie takes place in Pennsylvania, it was actually filmed in Cleveland and in this little town, Mingo Junction here.
Wow, I didn't know that.
But yeah, so what you were saying, back when the steel mills operated, the air was really polluted. I mean, the photograph of the man pushing the lawnmower uphill, somebody in that town told me that the power plant bought her a new car every few years because the paint on her car would corrode from the fall off from the plant next door. But they smelled terrible. These places smelled like sulfur. But nobody minded.
Yeah, they do.
When the mills were running, people would say, yeah, that's the smell of money. That means people are working.
That's the smell of money. Yeah, I've heard that before too. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm not interested just in describing the structures. I mean, describing the steel mills. I'm really interested more in making photographs that convey a sense of what it's like to live in this place, what it's like for the people there, even though I don't want to photograph people. But the photographs to me are very much about people. So, a different photographer might have concentrated on, say, just the blast furnace that you see in the background. I'm obviously referring to the Beckers here, I suppose. I'm not interested in that blast furnace on its own. I'm interested in the fact that someone's put up an above ground pool in this house where their view from their pool is up the steel mill. And someone else, their neighbors, put up this giant dish antenna that's pointing towards the mill as if it's sort of focused on it. And even, the details in the foreground, the sort of kind of quintessential American eagle symbol that they've put on their mailbox and the radio station logo, and just those little details that speak to a landscape where life is being lived, life is continuing. That, to me, that's what's really important about these pictures. And you were talking about the outside, the idea of an outsider. And so, of course, at first I was an outsider. And I remember when I made this picture, which was right at the beginning of the summer of '86, possibly the first day that I drove into the Ohio River Valley. I didn't really know what I was looking at, what these things were. I did not know that the building in the background, for example, was a brewery or had been a brewery. It was a ruin by this point, and sadly it was torn down recently. But I didn't know, what I was looking at was a dog and a dog house and all of this stuff that the dog has. He's got an exercise bike and a bicycle and a water heater. And he's got this other thing that I didn't know what it was on the bottom right of the picture. It's an oil drum that's been kind of cut open. And I honestly had no idea what that was at the time. Of course, you being from Texas, I'm sure recognize someone's taken an oil drum and cut it up and made a barbecue grill out of it or a smoker out of it.
Everyone does that. Yeah, everyone does that.
Everyone does it, right.
I knew exactly what that was.
For me, that was like a strange, exotic thing. And one of the things I thought about was the difference between this idea of America that you see in this picture here and the idealized idea of America that I'd grown up seeing in the books that I learned to read from. We had these English language primers that my godparents would send us from the US with Dick and Jane and the dog Flip. And, they had a little red wagon and the apple trees and the white picket fences. And it's this sort of Norman Rockwell-like vision of America that's perpetuated, in those reading primers. And I was interested in the contrast between that vision of the world and the reality on the ground, but also in the similarities. I mean, there are picket fences and there are dogs, although this dog is not Flip, and if he wasn't on a chain, I'd probably be running away from him. So this landscape struck me as something really kind of fascinating and exotic at first. But as I kept returning to it year after year, it also became something that was really, very familiar, and a place where I felt at home. I now have my own 55-gallon drum barbecue grill in my backyard. I guess what I want to do at this point is switch to looking at some more recent pictures, because while the Ohio was sort of the beginning of my interest in this landscape, I've now realized 40 years later that really this is my life's work. I mean, after Along the Ohio, I got a Guggenheim Fellowship that led me to photograph along the Gulf Coast. You're talking about being from Texas. I photographed a lot of those industrial areas on the Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur, all along the Texas coast, and worked in other projects. But at a certain point, around 2009, I was lent a digital camera by a camera store in Cleveland, and thought to myself, well, what can I photograph that, where I can really understand how this camera worked, what it's like to use a digital camera as opposed to film. And I thought, well, I'll just go back to a familiar landscape. I'll go back to the area around Pittsburgh, and ended up making pictures that day or that week, and subsequently, that I now realize is really a continuation of the work I did in the Ohio River Valley. I'm trying to find a picture here I guess this one's as good as any. That the story hasn't finished. I mean, having made a book about a particular landscape doesn't mean there aren't more pictures to be made there, because the landscape continues to evolve. People's lives continue to change. The economy changes as well. And so at this point, I realized that I'll never be done photographing this region. And when I first photographed here, no one called it the Rust Belt. That was a term that sort of came to prominence later. And it might have originally been derogatory, but as you were talking about people's pride in their landscape, in their place, there's also a pride in the idea of the Rust Belt. That it's exactly what you were describing, where people are proud of the place they're from and what that place has done and the work that they've done in that place and what that place has contributed to the country. And so I returned to photograph the Rust Belt around 2010 and have continued on and off since then, even while occasionally working on other projects. So this is really, I guess, perhaps one of the more sentimental pictures about the Rust Belt, in the sense that, even though we see this little community, is somewhat dilapidated, the houses aren't in great repair. At the same time, it's like this little oasis tucked away under this bridge, under this giant highway bridge. So at the same time, I've continued to photograph this landscape. And as I said earlier, I don't think I'll ever be done, because it's continuing to change. And in some cases, it's changing in ways that make it more challenging to photograph. There's a certain amount of belligerence and antagonism that's come about over the last 7 or 8 years, where people are not just curious or suspicious about outsiders, but in some cases overtly hostile. And they seem to all be packing weapons these days. So here you have a picture, I think, that exemplifies that. And again, I mentioned earlier that I try to make photographs that contain a huge amount of information. My goal, my hope, is that viewers will look at them long enough to see those details, because those details add to the picture, add to the story. Sometimes they complicate the story. And one of the wonderful benefits of switching to using a digital camera at this point is I can really have that detail. So I can make prints that are 30 by 40 inches, and viewers can go right up to the photograph and see information that I'm afraid your viewers are not going to be able to see on screen. But I just want to point out that the American flag that you see in the window of this building in the background, on the stripes, the red and white stripes, you have the song, The Stars and Stripes. The lyrics to the song are written out. And of course, you can't see this on screen this way. But in a 30 to 40 inch print, you can go right up to it and read it. And in the upper window on the left, there's actually a picture of a deer, which you won't see. But it's a bit of a paradox. It's a bit of a problem. There'll never be a book where those details will be visible. But on a wall in an exhibition, a closer look on the viewer's part is rewarded, in a sense, with more understanding, more information about the place beyond the fact that you're looking at a sign from a gun store.
There is a pride thing, but it's fascinating. There's also a protective nature to this. The guns and ammo, and then the no trespassing. It's like don't tread on me kind of vibe. That's very present in Middle America for sure. So it's interesting. You're getting it all in one image here. And
yeah, I mean,
I really, really like that image. Proceed, continue. Yeah.
Well, so moving right. I mean, and what you just pointed out, I think, is really central to how I think about my work and what I try to do. When you said you're getting it all into one image, I mean, I deliberately try. I'm not always successful, and sometimes I'll tolerate pictures that aren't successful in that way. But I try to have photographs that do get it all in one image, that pack together as much information, as much of the story as you can get. And so, again, here we have a scene that's partly industrial, partly domestic. What's in the background are the smokestacks of the original U.S. Steel plant, Andrew Carnegie's plant on the Monongahela River upstream from Pittsburgh. That's now been turned into a giant shopping mall. They left the smokestacks. That's it. Yeah. And there's this house along the railroad tracks, and the attempt to create this private little personal space. They've put up a little fence, and a fence made out of plastic tulips, and yet they're right smack up against some kind of industrial wall on the right. And so they've tried to decorate that as well. I don't know how clearly you can see it, but there's a ceramic rabbit at the bottom of that structure on the right. Mm-hmm. And there's a yellow ribbon, which I think says something. I can't see it either here, but it says something about there's some patriotic slogan: "Protect our troops" or "Bring home our troops" or something. Not "Bring home our troops," but something. Some kind of slightly militaristic, patriotic slogan on that yellow ribbon sticker. And so again, it's a matter of trying to get a sense of what matters to the people that live in this place, and I think one of the ongoing preoccupations of these pictures that I'm making in what we call the Rust Belt is that they are about a certain kind of version of the American dream, that they're not that stylized or saccharine version of the American dream that you see in, say, Norman Rockwell paintings or the reading primaries I was talking about, but that they're about the way people try to still, despite the circumstances under which they live, to create that little personal small piece of paradise for themselves. And so here is this tiny house crammed between two, commercial buildings that are not residential probably. And they've created this little oasis for their kids by fencing it off and furnishing it with everything you want. You've got your barbecue grill and your fire pit and the kids' toys and the parasol and lawn furniture and so forth. And I think there's something kind of touching and almost heroic, almost sort of resilient about the lengths that people will go to create a life for, their family that you see in the way that they've decorated their yards.
I love the color. They really tried to interject color into it. That blue trim, which is the great contrast. It's also like now, like when I look at your images, I'm looking at all the details. Did this little, it seems as if that this building that was off to the left might have had another part to it, but maybe was walled off in a certain degree. And so you have this like brick formation that forms a cross. Did you mean to capture that in there, or was that?
I have to admit that the fact that it was in the shape of a cross interested me. You know, the sort of hint of the kind of presence of religion, which is really pretty palpable in this landscape. But you know, literally what you're seeing there is it. You know, that building. There was no space between the building on the left and whatever building used to occupy this lot. Unlike on the other side, where clearly they put windows in, at least the upper ones were original. So that cross is actually probably the mark of the floor and the walls that divided the building up.
Yeah, the two. Yeah, I've seen that before. Yeah, and it's usually when you're like repurposing a place, and that's fascinating. That's another image where you're kind of packing in small town America right there.
Yeah. I mean, these are tough places to live, and the people who live there are tough, but they try to make the best of it. You know. Trying to think what to show you next. I mentioned that, you know, I've worked on other projects before returning to the Rust Belt. And so this is a photograph that's both in the Rust Belt, but that also I include in my project along the link of photographs along the Lincoln Highway. There was a certain point where I became tired of hearing people say to me, "Do you only ever photograph in Ohio?" Which, you know, more than anything betrayed their lack of knowledge of geography. The Ohio River is not only in Ohio; it goes through 7 different states. But you know, people didn't know that. So, and I started thinking about, you know, how do I photograph the whole country without being overwhelmed by photographing the whole country? And so I basically repeated what I'd done with the Ohio River, where the Ohio River becomes this structure that wends through these different states and through these different landscapes. But that gives structure to a project or to a book. And I discovered by accident that there was this thing called the Lincoln Highway, when one of my students said she was doing a project on the Lincoln Highway and kept showing photographs of things that I too had photographed. And I said, "What is Lincoln Highway?" And she explained to me. I don't remember what she said, but I now know that it was the first cross-country highway for motor vehicles in America, and it goes from Times Square in New York City to the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco. And it's kind of, it crosses sort of through every major geographical region of the US, except the Deep South and New England, and through every kind of place and terrain possible, through some of the most prosperous counties in America, like Montgomery County outside of Philadelphia, and through places that are complete ghost towns and completely uninhabited, through countryside and prairie and factory towns and everything in between. But this is actually along the Ohio River as well. So I'm sort of simultaneously sort of photographing the Lincoln Highway and continuing to photograph the Rust Belt here. But again, you were talking about getting it all in one picture. And then, you know, if you look at this picture, at first it's not of anything anyone would think to take a picture of, in a sense. You know, we're talking about the idea of the thing itself. What am I pointing to? But here, and in so many of my pictures, it's not really the one thing. It's more the scene. It's more everything that's in the picture becomes part of one's understanding of this landscape. And the Lincoln Highway, as this first, important cross-country highway, is filled with utilitarian structures that have to do with a road on which goods are transported. So you've got gas stations, and you've got pawn shops, and you've got strip clubs, which apparently are very popular among truck drivers. And, you know, so as you examine the details of this picture, you sort of get a sense of all those different things, which you don't see at first glance. You know, the club erotica in the background, and the little fuel man, almost with a little phallic figure there next to the figure of the idealized female figure in the E of club erotica. And then on the far left, the slot machine illustration that tells you it's a pawn shop and a place where you can buy lottery tickets and gambling and so forth. So again, I'm just photographing this version of America, but trying to encompass the details and the complexity and the contradictions of what's contained in the landscape.
First thing I noticed was the gas price, but that tells you where I'm from. And it also gives you a timestamp also. you said this is around 2010. People were really struggling with that back then. And so,
this is 2012, I think. But gas prices are not that far off what it shows there. I mean, right now,
well, now, but it's funny, but that was one of the big things that caused so much trouble in 2008, and you had those gas prices shoot up, and then the real estate crash and all of that stuff, and it just seemed like everything got way more expensive, and it caused a big issue. And it's interesting that when you said that, I instantly went back to that moment. I remember all of that. It was pretty insane. But then, this very expensive time, and then I know the 60 cent, the 59 cent, like tea. I'm like, oh, that's pretty cheap. That's pretty nice. It's just, you have so much kind of buried in this image. And when you're in these small towns, you'd look at it and you'd go, there's nothing here. But you're finding it and you're putting it in frames, and I have to admire you for that. Go ahead.
It's very rare that I photograph something that I saw from the car. So what happens instead is I'll get a vibe. I'll pass through a little town and I'll sort of see, okay, they still have a lot of older buildings, and oh, good, they have the alleys that run behind the houses. That's always useful. And then I'll say, okay, this looks promising, and I'll park and I'll walk around. And sometimes it's a waste of time, and 45 minutes later I drive off without having taken a single picture. But mostly when you're on the ground like that and sort of more intimately connected to the landscape is when you start to discover things. And so you were talking about 2008, and really I should have mentioned that, because that was kind of critical in my return to photographing the Rust Belt, this kind of post-industrial heartland. I returned to it, in 2009 simply to try out a digital camera, but that's when I really saw that things had gotten so much worse because of the global economic meltdown in 2008. And so, I would return to towns that I'd been at. Well, for example, this town, Duquesne, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, I'd photographed there in 2003. And so here I am 6 years later, and suddenly all these businesses that were open back then have been boarded up.
Yeah. And it just accelerated it. They were already declining, but and this is stuff that in a big city, what happens is somebody just buys up the cheap spot and puts in a new shop. But in these small towns, sometimes it's permanent, and that scar is still there. And but go ahead. What were you saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, rather to build on what you're saying, it's a factor of population. These places don't get bought up because there's plenty more if you want them, and there's nobody to patronize them. So, I mean, I imagine that Safari Club is still open in the background, but the building on the left was a beauty salon, a beauty shop, and it's a fancy beauty shop. It says SHOPPE. I had to lean forward to see the picture. Sorry, I couldn't remember. I knew it was a beauty shop. I didn't know what the exact. Oh, it's Dolly Madison or Dolly Allen's beauty shop.
Okay.
But, for me, one of the other things that's sort of, I think, really important in the pictures I make that I like best is where there sort of these, despite the nature of the subject matter, where there's something that's almost humorous that's happening at the same time. Humorous might not be the right term so much as kind of visual coincidences, and something I think about a lot, and that dictates how I frame things, what I include in the picture, how things line up in the picture. And for example, in this picture, I thought it was just absolutely amazing and wonderful and inexplicable that right across the street from the Safari Club you would have two lions. I mean, how does that come to be? How could that be? I don't know the answer. Yeah. It's not very interesting, but it's amazing to me in this world that's contained within this picture that's happening. And not just that, but that, the picture has two halves. On the left half, you have the beauty shop. On the right, you've got the Safari Club. And on the left, you have a lion that's pretty much the same kind of drab brown as all the colors in the building behind it, right? The beauty shop is yellow, brown, and red brown and brown tan brown, and the lion is brown. And on the right, the Safari Club has a lion that's exactly the same color as its sign. And to me, that kind of miracle is what I love about photography. It's funny. I remember showing this picture. I gave a talk for a job interview, actually, at a college a few years ago. And the department head interrupted me and said, well, what's the big deal? You could have simply brought a can of spray paint and made that lion yellow. And it would have been the same. And I said, no, it has nothing to do with that. To me, it's the picture has to be believable. I don't think anybody looking at this picture is going to think that I spray painted that lion to make him yellow. They're going to think, isn't that amazing that lion is yellow and the same yellow as the Safari Club, as if some kind of divine presence sort of made that coincidence. So I don't know. I mean,
one of the things that I noticed, especially when I saw this image, was, and I started to see it, once I saw it in this image, I started to look back through your work, and I'm glad you used the word humorous. There are some images where you laugh at the coincidence, but isn't that life though? But at the exact same time, there's a charm about these small towns. And I don't, there's a lot of people that would go through these places and probably not think that, they're old. Some of them are left behind. You can tell the young people have left, and most people are retired, and no one's really walking. I was going to say that you said you walk around. I bet you were the only person walking in some of these places. So, and they're probably looking at you funny, like, what's he doing out? Like, what's he walking around for? And so it's just a fascinating thing that you're paying attention to something that is no longer being paid attention to, and you're noticing things about these places. Why is that so important to you? Why do you feel like you're drawn to this? Because there's many people that have just turned their attention to other things, i.e. the phones that are in their pocket. What is it about small things like this? You know what I mean? And you're choosing to put your attention here. I'm kind of curious about that interest that you have.
Well,
why do you feel like it's important to you so much?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's partly an interest in what I'm photographing, that looking, it goes back to what I was saying about J.B. Jackson, this idea of reading the landscape, that looking closely helps you understand what you're looking at. But of course, that begs the question, why should I care? Why should I be interested in understanding this place?
What drives that desire? What drives that desire?
For me, it's really partly the nature of the place. I'm not interested equally in every place. I'm interested in this place because it has a complex story. Because it bears the evidence of the past and the present. Sometimes it hints at what might happen in the future. I'm interested in places that are complicated that way, that seem to mimic the structure or the fabric of life in some ways. The humor, I think, is partly a way of making the subject approachable, in a sense. I mean, there's so many pictures these days on the internet, on Instagram, of dilapidated buildings. I mean, there's just literally millions of them, and hundreds, if not thousands, of photographers photographing abandoned structures. There's this whole phenomenon now called ruins porn. I'm not interested in any of that. I mean, even though inevitably we see dilapidated buildings in some of my pictures, that's really not what interests me. I'm interested in sort of a more complicated, more human kind of story. And I'm interested in showing what's to be admired and respected and appreciated about places as much as I am about understanding their history. I'm going to switch series.
That's what I was trying to get to. What I really liked about that last part of what you were saying was you're also kind of pointing to something that's very human, and very much about it's almost like I don't want to go this broad, and I don't like going broad. But there's like this quintessential human nature of us to adapt and evolve with our space and our time, and whether we're keeping up or not really isn't that important. It's just how we interact with our environment as it changes. And that's one of the things that I've noticed. And the fact that you had mentioned ruin porn, which is, I have noticed a lot of it, but there's this very kind of, it's almost like people are addicted to the horror story in a way. And so there's something about it that's horrifying. But with you, you're kind of doing something different, which makes your work stand out against all of that. Which now I'm kind of curious. You took it out of the Rust Belt, and you decided to go to Europe and kind of look at it there. Why? What pulled you into Europe?
Well, I mean, obviously, we know from what I talked about earlier that I have roots in Europe. I grew up in Europe. I live
Of course.
I have a house in France, in the south of France. I mean, so we go there every summer. And I'd photographed in Europe. I mean, I did a project on hilltop villages at night in the Provence that you can see on my website. But what happens more specifically was that I became intrigued by a particular landscape. It's sort of odd. I was reading Germinal by Émile Zola, which is his great book about the coal mining region of northern France, and he's talking about these man-made mountains that are called terrils in French, which are I call them slag heaps. There are different translations of that, but basically there are these man-made mountains in the north of France that are the result of coal mining. And they figure very prominently in the book. And I thought, gee, I wonder what that really looks like. And I looked at pictures on the internet, and I thought, wow, for somebody who's interested in a landscape that's been formed by human activity in that landscape, a landscape that's really been transformed by humans' interaction in it, this is the quintessential example of that. So I decided to go see what it was like and see if I could make photographs there. And so you were talking about humor. Here in the photograph that we're looking at now, what you see in the center is one of those mountains. This is slag. This is the useless, worthless byproduct of coal mining. In other words, when the coal is extracted from soil, you're left with the stuff that's piled up into these mountains, and it's toxic. It contains, chemicals that make it not very hospitable to human activity. There are several hundred of them in this region of northern France. And what interested me as well was that it was a similar story to what we see in the Rust Belt, which is that this was a region that drove the French economy, that was enormously prosperous in an earlier era, and to the point where huge populations of people from other countries and other parts of France were brought in to work in the mines, like the Poles in particular from Poland. Much like the patterns of migration that we see in America in the Rust Belt, people from Europe and from other parts of the US, from the South, moving there to work. And now all of that's gone. The industry is left, and you're left with a landscape that has this complex and rich culture to it. And yet at the same time speaks to the difficult lives that people have in that landscape. We were talking about humor in pictures, and so it's a challenge to photograph subjects that are not particularly cheerful and hold the viewer's attention. And so I think for me, when there's something that lightens the mood of the picture, that makes it more effective. So obviously in this picture, the strange repetition of the word wash, wash, wash in multiple colors with that big American car against that bleak man-made mountain in the background, and then that optimistic note of that forsythia, that round forsythia bush in bloom. I mean, somehow all those things tend, the humor and those details tend to mitigate the bleakness of what we're seeing in the background, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, and it's fascinating. It's in English, and it's a big American car there, a big American muscle car, in France.
Well,
I find these American influences everywhere, but it's I don't know that that's purely American either. It could have been just any. I think that's fascinating.
Well, it's funny because I was just, as I told you, in West Virginia a few days ago, and thinking about how important cars are to the people that live in that landscape, who are often very impoverished. I mean, they're living in trailer homes that, started falling apart 50 years ago. And yet they all have brand new pickup trucks or brand new muscle cars.
Brand new trucks, yep. Yes, they do.
Or Camaros or Mustangs, or Chargers.
Oh, yeah. And they're working on it every night. Yeah, yeah.
But the funny thing is the same thing happens, the same exact phenomenon happens in the north of France in these former mining communities. People worship big cars. I saw more Porsche Panameras in these impoverished communities in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais than I've seen anywhere else. They're all older, secondhand, slightly beat up, but big expensive luxury cars where people are otherwise living in homes that were cheaply built by the mining companies, 100 years ago. So, for example, here you have, and it's really an interesting phenomenon because there was such competition among the mines and such a lack of manpower that they would build entire cities with music schools and hospitals and swimming pools and regular schools and all the infrastructure to attract people to come and work for their mine by living in their town. And they're in French, they're called corons, which there isn't really a good English translation of, but they're basically workers' housing estates, and they're all over the place in this landscape. And some of them are, have been fixed up. Many of them are abandoned. Here you have one that's been condemned, and so all the window openings and doors have been covered with steel that they bothered to paint a kind of reddish pink, so it integrates with the colors of the building itself. But this is a condemned structure. And again, I mean, it's difficult to photograph these things. We're talking about ruin porn and not have them just be simplistic, not have them be simply about sort of someone's kind of crude awe at destruction, And so I'm always trying to find these little details that bring back a human element. This might be over the top in this particular picture, that giant stuffed bear. I remember my father telling me a story. He was a journalist. He was a war correspondent. And he was telling me a story about a film crew for one of the big American networks in Vietnam that always traveled with a beat up doll. And so when they were filming something and they needed more poignant human interest, they would toss that doll into the foreground while they were filming a scene having to do with the Vietnam War. So I'm a little suspicious of my own picture here, but I wanted to give you a sense of, and the viewers a sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about these communities that were built up that were constructed specifically for the mine workers. This is another one that, again, as you can see, has fallen in very hard times. The windows of the buildings in the foreground have been boarded up to keep people from breaking into what are basically condemned abandoned structures. And yet at the same time, you have that sense of, you can see the ghost of a community through the structure of the space, the buildings to either side and the walls. And just, you can imagine this alley in a different time populated with kids. So what I realized when I started photographing in northern France is that it's really the same kind of story in this landscape as in the Rust Belt, that this is Europe's equivalent of our Rust Belt. It's a place that was once central to the economy, and it's been overlooked and abandoned. And there's so much history and pride that's been sort of passed by that I'm interested in making photographs that, to some extent, preserve that history. And at the same time, describe what's happened to the places. I mean, I'm not interested in nostalgia. I'm not trying to recreate the past. I mean, these weren't necessarily places where it was the mines were not a fun place to work or a good place to work, and steel mills not much better either. And yet they were important places to work, and these are important places that we now overlook. I mean, we have one of the things I've tried to photograph when I photographed along Lincoln Highway was this tendency that we have to recreate the past in a way that's oversimplified and sugar-coated and has no real bearing to what happened in the past. Unfortunately, I'm so uninterested in those places that I'm not going to be able to show you pictures to illustrate my point. But maybe here, there's a sense of nobody ever, in this photograph of these guys painting this house, this is not in the coal mining region of northern France. This is in Lorraine, which was the heart of what's known as the Pays de Fer, which is France's former steel heartland, where all the steel mills and iron plants and so forth were. Nobody ever painted a house this blue back in, when the steel mills are still working. But now there's this sense of recreating the past in more exaggerated, more vivid terms. And they're not whitewashing it, they're blue washing it, but it's basically the same. It's this kind of similar idea, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's like adding color to something that didn't have color. It's, France has a deep history in art, and even in the way that buildings were embellished and houses as well. It's fascinating, and you keep going back to that idea of bucking the term nostalgia, and you keep challenging that word in a lot of ways. And I know I asked you before, what was it about that word and stuff like that? And are you just in a way, you're kind of documenting a now, and you're trying not to make a connection to the past, even though a lot of people, when they probably see your images, oh, I remember that place. I remember what it looked like. And that's the nostalgic memory part that people have. Are you challenging memory in some ways too?
No. I guess I think if I'm reacting to that particular word, or if I'm using that particular word in a pejorative sense, it's because of what I was just talking about, in this idea that we have, this tendency we have, we see it in America, but we see it in France as well, of recreating the past in ways that are not historically accurate, evoking the past in ways that have no bearing on the past. They only, the classic example in America is Colonial Williamsburg, which was rebuilt to be a recreation of colonial past, but is historically completely inaccurate. And you see this all the time through architectural decoration in France. New shopping malls that go up that are supposed to look like that refer in some way to architecture of the past, and yet there's nothing really architecturally correct or architecturally connected about it. So to me, nostalgia has to do with misremembering the past, remembering the past incorrectly. And you see this a lot now, and we're living this literally right now as we enter this presidential election, where I'm reading in today's New York Times that voters right now have literally forgotten what it was like when Trump was president. They don't remember all the bad stuff. A mere less than 4 years ago, so there's this tendency to whitewash the past, to gloss over it, to make it seem simpler, less complicated, less contradictory than it really was. That's what
it was interesting.
My objection to the idea of nostalgia comes in. So, for example, here's a picture of something I found myself photographing a lot in France. This again is in Lorraine. Laundry. And why laundry? Well, I'm attracted to it. It sort of seems to create meaning on multiple levels. First of all, it's shaped like people, so it evokes people. They have arms and legs, and it tells you something about people's personal, intimate lives. I mean, you don't normally look at other people's underwear or socks, and so it's a glimpse into someone's interior life, even though it's not literally inside this house. At the same time, it evokes a different era. I mean, in America, you don't see this anymore. Even in West Virginia, even in the poorest parts of West Virginia where I just was, people don't put out laundry. Everyone has a washer or dryer, washer and dryer. Yeah. And there's something kind of poetic about how laundry hangs there. It has a kind of rhythm, a kind of pattern to it because it's all in a line, like notes on a music staff. So, it's functioning on multiple levels, visually, sociologically, and so forth. But, what you're really looking at here is yet another housing development built for factory workers. Cheaply built, people living right on top of each other, paper-thin walls, the people in the house on the left that they've bothered to change color compared to the house on the right, will hear everything that's happening next door. I mean, that's not something you can tell from the picture, but anybody who has any knowledge of what these communities that were built for factory workers, somehow, there's a kind of tension between the facts that are being described and a certain kind of beauty in the picture, I guess, if that makes sense. I mean, I mean, that better makes sense because I think it's really central to what I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to gawk at destruction in photographs that show, places that are semi-ruined. And I'm not trying to sneer at, people whose lives are unfortunate. I remember once putting up a photograph in a faculty show of a trailer home in Kentucky and one of my colleagues laughing at it because the people were so impoverished. I was furious. I'm trying to find something of hope and beauty in these places that are not necessarily that don't conventionally evoke hope. I mean, really, that's the gist of it. I mean, if I'm drawn to this particular kind of landscape, it's because I'm hoping to find hope in it. There's no real surprise in photographing some prosperous brand new housing development where everyone's well off and comfortable and complacent. The surprise is in finding these moments of beauty or joy or humor, in a landscape where you wouldn't expect it. And so, if we look at this picture, I mean, part of it is just a play on scale. That house looks so tiny that the forsythia bush is almost bigger. And again, it goes back to what you were talking about, about humor. I mean, I think the, humor on a different level here, where it's humor that has to do with the form of the photograph, perhaps, is also important in causing the viewer to look more carefully, to pay more attention, to consider that this thing that they're seeing in the photograph in this difficult landscape might have value.
That's amazing.
I want to show you a couple more pictures which sort of relate to where I've come around again. Let me see if I can. This is another photograph from my book Along the Ohio, which is a landscape that I found myself returning to even after photographing extensively in Western Europe these last few years. Just recently, this year, really a few months ago, I've returned to photographing in this area we call the Rust Belt. Partly, as a kind of way of dealing with the presidential election that's coming up. I'm photographing in places that have turned out to be, very much places that support Trump. And I feel that these abandoned landscapes that we've paid so little attention to are now suddenly really critical for the future of our country. And I'm not sure how photographing them is going to make any kind of difference, but it's drawn me to return to them and to reconsider what's happened in the decades that have passed between my initially photographing them and now. And so here we have a photograph that appeared in my book Along the Ohio. This was taken in 1986 in East Liverpool, Ohio, which shows a house behind a factory. In fact, the factory that you see on the left in the background, we saw another picture of earlier with the dog in the foreground, the vertical picture with the dog with the barbecue grill. But what I've been doing is returning to some of these places to sort of understand what's happened in the interim. And I don't think I've arrived at any great conclusions about what's happened, but I think sometimes it's interesting to take a look at the pictures. So here you see the same alley that I was just talking about, taken recently. And I guess to me, I mean, obviously the first difference is that this is in color and the other's in black and white, and now I'm working with a digital camera and so forth, but that's not really what's interesting. It's more that a place that looked already pretty dilapidated back in 1986 has just deteriorated even further, and yet, if there was any question about it, we see life is still going on. You know, there are signs of that the house is inhabited. There's not a sense that this is a ruin. Someone's put that little red ribbon outside of that window there, and there's a barbecue grill on the porch and a dog that's stumbling his way towards that porch, presumably. And so I've started to revisit places that I photographed 20 or 30 years ago, in part because the story of what's happened to those places over that time seems to me tied into what's happening politically at this moment in the United States, where people are turning towards a potential would-be dictator out of a kind of desperation. I mean, this is not essentially a story of conditions having improved. You know, in returning to these landscapes, as often as not, I'm finding them further deteriorated, more abandoned. People are worse off than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And I don't really know where this is going to take me. As I said, this is work that I've begun very, very recently. This picture is from a couple of years ago, but this idea of returning to this post-industrial Rust Belt landscape now, as we approach a presidential election, seems to me kind of critical. It's not clear the photographs can explain anything. I just hope that I can make pictures that will perhaps provoke people to think about things.
It seems like the political atmosphere that's starting to kind of take over America. It seems like people are arguing about things that some would deem not as important as some of these issues that some of these folks experience in these small towns. And everyone's debating about all these different things, you know what I mean? But none of them are really important to these folks. And so they go, well, you guys are arguing, we're suffering. And maybe in some ways, this forgetting in these places not evolving and not changing is the problem. I think in a lot of ways, you're capturing exactly the point. Some of these places haven't even evolved, even as they were deteriorating in the 80s when you were looking at them. Yeah. And in the early 90s. And that's the point. It's like we've just devolved into these arguments that split us ideologically, but don't really ever solve any problems. And it's interesting. It's definitely very, very interesting. And I think it is important that you remind people, well, this is why people are thinking the way they think. If you want to know why a Trump figure is rising, it's because of that kind of stuff. And I think it's fascinating being, I've been away for a while, and I kind of look back and I watch it, kind of seeing that stuff. And so it's a very interesting time we live in. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. Interesting is sort of a mild way to put it. Yeah. It's a frightening time to live in. But anyway, I'm just here right now and trying to look at what's there and trying to make pictures that don't exactly explain anything, but that might in some way illuminate things to some extent.
Looking at it at two different times, and there's something really strikingly eerie about you that photo and this photo sitting next to each other, realizing that they're 20 years apart, or 30, 40 years apart?
Well, let's see.
Would that be 40 years?
16, almost 40. Yeah.
This was almost 40 years apart. And it's almost unchanged. It's almost, yeah. it's almost identical, barring a dog there. It's a fascinating look, and I think it's important. So when you think about your work, when you're photographing, you have some really interesting things that you point at, which I love that analogy that you were talking about. How do you see this stuff come to the world? How do you think about it as a book when you're shooting it? Do you think about exhibitions, or are you just kind of making images and allow the work kind of to translate itself into a final product? How do you bring your work to a book and stuff like that? How do you think about that stuff when you start looking at contact sheets?
I absolutely think about books.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I haven't been very active with exhibitions of late. When I was still teaching, it was important to do that stuff. It was expected that if you taught art, you were an active practicing artist, and you demonstrated that by exhibitions, among other things. The impetus to do that has not been as strong. I'm much more interested in books. It's just, it's complicated. I mean, the process of getting a book to press. Many of my books have been published by the same person, even though they're under different imprints. I just haven't been very happy of late with the process. And so I'm trying to find a new publisher and thinking about alternatives. But I expect almost everything I've ever photographed. I mean, if you go to my website, you'll probably see, 14 different series. Almost every one of them is potentially a book, or I have a book in mind of that body of work. I'm not sure about the photographs from Europe from the last 5 years. I don't see separate books on Belgium and France, but I see perhaps both of those being part of a larger book that might incorporate maybe Poland, if I can figure out how to photograph there without speaking the language, or other sort of important industrial places in Northern Europe. But no, I mean,
you can call it Western Rust. There you go.
That's right. I mean, to me, the book, when I think about photography as a medium, really, I think the paramount manifestation of this medium is the photography book. I mean, even, you look back at Eugene Atget, the great French photographer, whom I am more interested in than any other photographer. I mean, he compiled his photographs into albums. He was physically making books of his pictures, besides the fact that a book of his work appears very shortly after his death in the 1920s. Books reach an audience that's much broader, but also more varied, more diverse than exhibitions. People see a book, they pick up a book, they bump into a book, they borrow a book, it's at the library. There are ways that they come across them. Going to see a show requires a different kind of effort and a different kind of commitment and a different kind of mindset. And so although I'm paradoxically making these pictures now that have all of this minuscule detail that you probably wouldn't see unless it was a coffee table book the size of the coffee table itself.
Hey, I would take that. Go ahead.
Well, there was one made for Helmut Newton a few years ago. There was a book that actually came with 4 feet, but you have to be
oh my gosh,
Helmut Newton has to get away with that. But no, I mean, I do think the book is really what I'm interested in. I mean, when I think about the history of the medium of photography, I can almost see it in terms of books. I mean, there was a very important Atget book that came out in the 20s. You think about Robert Frank's American Photographs, Walker Evans, Robert Frank's The Americans, Walker Evans' American Photographs. I mean, it's books that matter to me. And so, I'm always thinking about books. I'm always thinking about the photographs as a kind of linear sequence, as a project, as something that will become a book. It's just logistically a complicated process, an expensive process to bring about. But hopefully there'll be more books.
I just have one more question for you. And that is the one I ask everyone. And this question is, there's a lot of people that are photographers that watch this show, people that are interested in becoming image makers themselves. And I'm curious if you have any advice for them.
One thing I would say to aspiring photographers is worry less about success and worry more about being true to yourself and finding your own voice as a photographer. Don't think about what is popular. Don't think about what you think is going to make you successful. Be honest with what you're trying to say and how, the pictures you're making. This comes from a lifetime of teaching photography and dealing with young photographers who are trying to make careers for themselves. And it's pretty much advice I've been giving for a long time that's been ignored by many, many, many people. I'll give you an example. I have a former colleague from the university where I used to teach, who kept pestering me relentlessly in his first few years because he wanted to know, the path to success. He kind of thought that I somehow had some secrets about being so-called successful as an artist, and he wanted me to share them with him. And I said, well, don't worry so much about the trappings of success. Don't worry so much about, being successful among your local community. Really think about what's important to you and the work you want to do, and spend less time, in sort of trivial social activities having to do with art, and concentrate just on making your work away from the world, in a sense. He totally ignored me and did exactly the opposite, and now is a relatively successful minor artist in our region. But the work's all over the place, and he never really did anything that seemed honest and true to himself and original to his own experience of being in this place, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So I think young photographers, not all of them, but having taught all these years, there are young photographers who worry too much about success, about the signs of success. When I became a photographer, there was no such thing as a successful photographer. Yes, if you were going to be a commercial photographer, but you couldn't, as a photographer, make a living as an artist. You had to have a teaching job or some other way of making a living. You didn't have the market that exists now. I talked to photographers going through the graduate program I went through, and they expect to make livings as photographers selling their work through galleries when they graduate. We never aspired to that. It just wasn't even feasible in those days. You just try to make the best pictures, most honest pictures you can. That would be. Is that answering your question? I almost forgot your question at this point.
It does. It's a great answer. And no, you believe it or not, I hear that a lot. And maybe one day I'll take all of these answers and make maybe a film or something. I don't know. But I think it's really good advice, and I hear that a lot. But I also think that's a secret to so many things, is just stay true to yourself. Do what it is that you do, and the thing is that you have more endurance when you stay true to yourself, because it just comes out of you naturally. It doesn't take energy, and so it's great. I think it's great advice. So how can people find you? How can people connect with you? Is that this is where you can give us your website, if you are.
I'm really easy to get in touch with. My website is myname.com. So as long as you don't misspell it, www.andrewborowiec.com. And once you're there, Perfect. There's a tab called Contact. And if you click on that, you can email me.
Perfect.
I'm not hard to find at all.
Perfect. And do you have a social media account? Do you do social?
Yeah. What do I do?
Instagram.
Is it Instagram? This is terrible.
I thought I found you. I thought I found you on there. Yeah.
Yes, of course. I'm sorry. I was blanking out. You're talking social media. I was getting confused with Facebook. I'm not on Facebook. I am on Instagram. A few years ago, somebody talked me into being on Instagram, and my wife said, if you're going to do this, you have to do it not halfway. She said, you need to post a picture on Instagram every day. And so every day, literally since that time, for the last few years, I've posted one picture. So
Nice.
every day I post a picture to Instagram, and it's not pictures about my life or my dog or any of that stuff. It's real photographs.
When I found you, I saw it was your work. So you get a lot of those images that we talked about today, and I love it. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really, it was wonderful.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this as well.
Awesome. And to all those who have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on the Urbanaut Podcast. If you like content like this, please like, share, and comment down below. That all helps us with the algorithm, so make sure you do that for us. And then also, if you want to support programs like this, consider joining and being a member of our Patreon page. And that's at patreon.com under the Urbanaut Podcast. And as always, we'll see you next time.